Well, thank you very much. It was really brilliant. And I'm very happy because I wrote an article yesterday. The conclusion was not different from what you said today here. Of course, without your basis, but anyhow, by intuitively, I think that the geopolitics have become fragile, and the Brazilian situation, considering the world, is challenging. We are in bad shape in political terms because of populism, and not just because, but anyhow, is one of the elements within the Brazilian political scene. And also, we have to take into account what's going on. Your conclusion is quite obvious. China is, the West is moving up, the East is moving up, and the West is moving down. We are in between. Let's take the advantage of that. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Okay, as we usually do, we will take 3 questions at a time. Then Martin will answer them. I ask people to raise their hands. 1 hand is enough to identify him or herself and make a concise question, starting with Felipe Hashtag there.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the issue of productivity, because most of your argument is very, underlying argument is based on the low productivity that we've seen in the last 20 years, and you're quite pessimistic about that in the future. And we had a few presentations recently talking about that we are on the eve of a new technological revolution with robotization, artificial intelligence, and a huge change similar to the one we had with the Industrial Revolution or in the 20th century. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Anyone else?
Yes, okay.
I'm sure Pastori wants to make a question. And Olga. Okay, so he needs a mic. And then you, Olga.
I'll go back to the chart you presented, comparing Bob Shiller's rates of return with rates of interest. And go back to the secular stagnation thing and to the perspective of interest rates. 2 months ago, we received here in Brazil the visit of Stanley Fischer. Mm-hmm. That presented some evidences that both in the US and in Europe, the central banks have brought interest rates down to the level of the neutral rate of interest, which is now much lower than it had been in the past. Mm-hmm. He presented no explanation for that. He presented a certain number of hypotheses about it. I said the main conclusion is that for the point of view of emerging markets, we are probably going to see low rates of interest in the world for a long period of time, and that favors emerging markets because capital tends to flow to emerging markets. And this is what is happening, let's say. Even countries like Brazil or like South Africa, which are facing deep political crisis, are not seeing their currencies depreciating or the sovereign bonds spreads increasing. And this is particularly a consequence of these large inflows to emerging markets. But on the other hand, these are low and rates of returns are also low. So in general, in the past, we could look to low interest rates. We would say, well, an investment is going to pick up and then the economy is going to recover. But something has happened on the real side of the economy that brought rates of return down. That really resembles the idea that there is a secular stagnation that cannot be overcome by monetary policy. We need some different changes in the world. So I want to pick up your views on that issue.
Okay, very happy.
And Elga, the last one in the first round, Elga Hoffman. There.
It's a very broad question, but I'm not convinced that it's the economy stupid, as was said once, is still prevailing. Just one example, Catalonia is one of the richest areas in Europe, and yet there is a clearly populist insurrection or whatever we call it. So I would like to hear you more about this relationship between economic and political.
Okay.
Economics and politics.
Now back to you, Martin.
These are enormous questions, which the question is whether one can give a manageable response. Fortunately, the answers to the first two questions are more or less the same. I mean, they're the same question asked in different ways. And I'll come to the last question separately. Which I think is relatively simple. Relatively simple. Okay, but let's think about the past and the future. Okay, I think it's clear what's happened in the past, and the question that you raise is really about what's going to happen now. Now, there are some people who deny the evidence from the past because they think we're not measuring properly, and my answer to that is it's a very important answer. We don't measure GDP and productivity correctly. There's absolutely certain. We know that. We're certainly better at measuring it now than we were 70 years ago, 60 years ago, because our statistical services have improved quite dramatically and methodology has improved. And we have no reason whatsoever, and I will insist somewhat, to think that about 10 to 15 years ago, suddenly our statistical services became exceptionally incompetent and started to mismeasure more profoundly than ever before. The problems of measuring the new technologies are considerable, but there have always been massive problems in measuring the impact of new technologies on productivity. Bob Gordon has a wonderful example that if you look at the American Consumer Price Index, which goes back quite a long way, before we did GDP, they didn't include motor vehicles well into the 30s. Which was after almost all the innovation in motor vehicles that already happened, after the Ford Model T and so forth. So we've always been lousy, but we're no lousier than before. Real GDP is probably growing significantly faster than we are measuring it. This is a point Marty Feldstein makes, and I think that is correct. The very famous work by Bill Nordhaus on the price of light has already indicated how badly we mismeasured the price of light. So I think underlying productivity growth is faster than we are measuring, but it has certainly declined. And then that leaves, if that is correct, that means that since productivity growth, as William Baumol and others have argued, is the main driver of growth in the long run, growth prospects look worse. If growth prospects look worse, that's the single most important determinant of the real interest rate. Both theory and evidence would support the view that there will be quite a strong connection between the real interest rate and the potential real rate of growth. And it will, if you want to turn it into supply and demand for loanable funds terms, if the potential rate of growth is low, investment will be weaker, and if investment is weaker, that means that you're more likely to have excess savings, and that will tend to mean that real interest rates will fall. And I think that is exactly what we've seen. Despite a massive collapse in real interest rates, investment is really pretty weak everywhere, except for that temporary colossal investment boom we saw in China, which ended to a significant degree in about 2012. So the secular stagnation model in macro terms, as Larry has put it forward, Larry Summers has put forward, links very well with this perception that over the last 10 years ago, probably going back to about 2004-05, nobody knows exactly, underlying trend productivity growth has slowed in the frontier, and that affects everybody, always affects everybody. It is also true, and that's a separate issue, that with the exception of China, the catch-up process, and India to some degree, has really slowed too. So as I indicated to you, and I could have indicated for many more countries, most emerging countries are not catching up either. So we've got secular stagnation. And I think that fits fairly well the story. We have a very good paper, which I recommend, published by the Bank of England 2 years ago, which is widely cited, which does a decomposition on the real rate of interest. And of course, productivity growth is a very big factor, savings, so forth. Then the question is the future. Okay, will this change? And there are two elements in this. First of all, I accept fully there are important technological innovations going on. No doubt about that. I am personally skeptical about how significant those will turn out to be in raising the real rate of growth. And there are two reasons for my skepticism, which doesn't mean I'm right. We really don't know. It's the future. The wonderful thing about the future is we can all have our own views on the future. But there are two very important things that are worth remembering, which is what the two basic propositions. As I indicated, and I could spend a lot more time talking about this, between about 1880 and 1930, innovation affected every single aspect of the economy, its communication system, its energy system, its transport system, its production systems, because of electricity and all the rest of it, communications, obviously radio and all the rest of it, its health systems. These were absolutely profound changes of everything. What we tend to forget is how many parts of the economic system, and I'm talking in the at the frontier, have not changed in the last 6 years. We have very nice things like this, iPads and iPhones, and your children are probably all on them all the time and so forth. But the speed of our transport is generally slower than it was 60 years ago. Civil aviation hasn't improved a jot. It's got a little bit more efficient. The 747 is still flying the plane. And I got into the first 747, I think, when I was 22. The ships... The cars are all blocking the roads. So we have to go back to bicycles in London, which is a 1900 technology. The rate of improvement of life expectancy at the frontier, not here, has slowed. It's quite clearly slow, as you would expect, because infant mortality is collapsing. So that other major source of improvement has deteriorated. And so what we have is a massive improvement in our ability to generate and distribute data. And that is clearly very important. But there are lots of our life which is material, which is not so massively affected by this. So that's the first point. This is what Robert Gordon's point, that it's an intense but relatively narrow change. And it is important to remember that this information revolution is not new. We tend to despise it now. But the mainframe was a really big deal. It completely transformed information processing in business. You know, we lost all the clerks. All the blank clerks, all the people who used to do these writing and things, we lost them long ago. That was a big technological revolution. That's the first point. And the second point is what, if you might like, and I could go much further, is an inversion of Baumol's famous law. Baumol's famous law is that government gets stuck with higher and higher costs because real wages rise because there's rising productivity in the private sector, but you can't do the same thing in government so easily because they have labor-intensive services and government has a few other problems. So government gets more and more expensive and people don't want to pay more taxes. So what that means is that government tends to get worse and worse. It's Baumol's law. But I think it's a general point. And so I'll put it forward as Wolf's proposition, because I haven't seen anybody else make it in this way, which is essentially very simple. All the sectors where we are really good at raising productivity disappear. They become very, very small. So I will give you the two most famous examples and then the counterexample. I don't know the figures for Brazil, but I imagine it's been similar, but over a more recent period. But back in the early 19th century, 70-80% of GDP and 80% of people in the West worked in agriculture. And we've done so well now, it's 1%. Less than that. It used to be, when I was a child, 40% of British GDP was manufacturing. It's now 10. It's 10 in the United States. It's 10 in France. It's a bit higher in Germany, but not dramatically higher. These are the two sectors where productivity growth is and will continue to be with automation. There will be nobody working in a factory anywhere 30 or 40 years from now. I'm absolutely sure of it. And at that point, raising productivity will cease to be relevant in manufacturing, because basically there won't be any people. So what we end up with, the ever larger shares of our economy, are by definition in the sectors that are most difficult to raise productivity in. The health sector, the education sector, the tourism sector, personal services of every kind you can imagine, looking after old people, looking after children, running the government and all the rest of it. These can improve with these new technologies to some degree. And maybe we'll come to a time when robots look after your grandparents or parents or yourself, and robots look after your children. Your children are taught in schools by robots, and robots look after
What
you
a
when
wonderful
you go,
world,
when you
right?
go to a hotel. But this is not the world we live in now, and there is no sign of it. We could get rid of all the drivers in cars, and that's not insignificant, but it's really not going to affect the aggregate productivity statistics. If we want to change aggregate productivity in the developed world, we have to revolutionize services which are the most difficult to change. And I think it won't happen. So my conclusion is no. We are stuck where we are. But I hope I'm wrong, with one exception. I think it would be very, very depressing if artificial intelligence took over everything we did, and I'm reasonably confident from my interaction with computers that it's a little way away. Now, but final point about Catalonia. I think it's an important point, because I agree. First of all, I think there's a very complex interaction between economic and social and cultural forces. And if I had a long discussion, I'd do many discussions. I'm writing a book about this. It's clearly many other things. But let me take Catalonia, because I've been in Madrid recently, and I've been talking with the government about it, including very high ministers, not the Prime Minister, but very senior ministers. And I think he made the point. Spain has had a massive economic crisis, a massive economic crisis. I think bigger than yours. I think their shrinkage in GDP was bigger than yours. Unemployment reached about 30%. Now, Catalonia is a rich region, but Catalonia was very badly affected by the crisis too. It was not unaffected. And this crisis is associated in the minds of the Spanish people very clearly with the incompetence, malfeasance, and indeed corruption of many of their leaders, including, not least, if I may say so, the Spanish Prime Minister. Right, who is regarded, rightly or wrongly, I make no comment, by many Spaniards as being corrupt. So the people of Spain are disgruntled and unhappy, very disgruntled and unhappy. When such things happen, political entrepreneurs of various kinds will find ways of exploiting these grievances. And they could come out in a coherent, cohesive nation state like France. They can come out with just by hating Europe and immigrants. In a nation state, like a state like Spain, where there was already not inconsiderable sentiment in Catalonia, not dominant, but clearly not of a separatist kind with a history and so forth, that's one of the ways you catalyze politically this sort of discontent. And it's happened in Britain with the Scottish independence, which I think is also related to our crisis, and of course Brexit, which is against Europe. So my view is, once you have these huge economic shocks, which are always associated with a sense that the elite has failed you, always, as they did in the 30s, new political forces, or possibly existing ones, will exploit them for their own purposes in protectionist, nationalist, populist ways. And in Spain, and particularly in Catalonia, so deep was the shock and so great was the anger that in Catalonia they've been successful. About half the population supports this, as far as I can see, maybe more or less, in making separatism from corrupt Spain the road to power, a road to power. So that and we've seen the same thing, but obviously not in a separatist form, in a nationalist form with Mr. Trump in America. So I think that the economics makes politics fragile. And when politics are fragile, a whole range of nasty, or you might regard them as benevolent, possibilities emerge. And that's what I think has happened. That's how I see the interaction between these two things. Far too long, these answers.
Very good
But they
answers.
were huge
Very-
questions.
Very good answers. Second and last round. All right. 1, 2, 3. One here, Luis Felipe, and then the...
In your presentation, you touchly brushed upon the possibility of inflation rate rising and causing interest rates to rise therefore. Could you possibly touch upon the reasons or the possibilities or the scenarios that would cause inflation to rise?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Luis Felipe. No mercado financeiro.
Yeah, you have said about major change and political and economic shift from to Asia. Is it possible to create a new political order with no common sense around values? Because all international order was kept by having a common sense around certain values that we have to preserve. If we don't have that, is it possible to have a stable political order?
Acho que é ali, olha. Não sei. Quer que se identifique? Não sei o que é.
Reading your newspaper, it would appear that the British establishment is fumbling its response to Brexit. Do you agree? And if so, what are the chances you think that it can recover and deliver something workable for UK and Europe?
All right, good.
Are you Irish? Yeah, okay. Shall I take these 3 questions?
Yeah.
Okay, these are also wonderful questions. I've just written a column before I came here this morning. I got up this morning to write my latest column on the very question of inflation. And so let me give you I don't believe it is a very large risk. But let me tell you the story that seems to me most plausible. It would clearly emanate from the US. The US is the focus. And it's a very, very fascinating situation. So the US now has, on standard historical measures, slightly over full employment. That is to say, unemployment is below what most US economists, and I have no comment on that, have historically regarded as the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. God, that's a horrible phrase, but there we are. There is evidence that on some other measures, labor market slack still exists, and that's shown with relatively low employment rates among people prime age people between 25 and 54, and still moderately high numbers of people who are involuntary part-timers. So there is a plausible argument that labor market still has a fair amount of slack. But we don't know. We really don't know. And on many other measures, and Janet Yellen has a speech which I cite on 26th of September, which I think is a wonderfully lucid speech, as her speeches are, simply going through all the facts and arguments. You can plausibly argue that America is fairly close to full employment on standard measures. The economy is expected to grow close to 2.5%, which is certainly above, unless there's a huge upsurge in productivity trend, and that suggests the labor market will continue to tighten. Probably significantly. The US Fed is tightening slowly, but at current rate of interest, I saw them, it's still 1.25%, very supportive. I mean, these are close to historic lows. And there might be a very, very big fiscal boost. There might be. The plan from the Trump administration is for a very, very large net tax cut. And nobody knows who the next Fed chair will be. And it could be, indeed, if it isn't Janet Yellen, it will certainly be somebody incompetent or politically driven, because I know them all. There's one possible candidate who would not be incompetent, but doesn't know anything like as much about as Janet Yellen would not be, and that's Mr. Powell, who's a member of the Fed and is a perfectly reasonable, though limited man. The others are just completely out to lunch as far as serious candidates for this job. And I've lived long enough to see some really lousy, I mean, I can remember Miller at the Fed. So, I mean, the Fed has made enormous mistakes over this period. Enormous mistake, because it's an incredibly difficult job. But if we have that fiscal policy and those people, then we would probably have a return to the Nixon-Burns period. And you surely all know how that ended in terms of global inflation and the disruption, which actually led ultimately to your debt crisis. So this is a big deal. So the nightmare is they won't tighten fast enough. They'll have a huge fiscal boost. Unemployment will start going towards 3%, and then inflation will start rising. And because the US monetary authority is always the global monetary authority, nobody will allow, this is a dollar depreciation situation, obviously, standard. You are not going to allow your exchange rates to explode upwards. You're going to import their monetary policy, because you always do. It's a mistake, but it's what you're going to do. And the result is the inflation will become global. The US has all, now, the Chinese will probably not import it. Not clear. They have some degree of freedom. So we don't have a completely Fed-dominated world as before, and I don't think the ECB will import it madly. I don't think they will. But a lot of the world will, and you certainly will. So that, I think, is likely to be, and it will get to some degree, not as it used to, into commodities. So inflation might go in the US to 4 or 5%. I'm not talking about 10 as before. But inflation went to 4 or 5%. To kill that, and at some point it will be killed, American short rates would probably have to go to 7 or 8. And if American short rates go to 7 or 8, you're in Armageddon territory given current debt levels and current, because though long-term real rates might not move much, but long-term conventional bonds would shoot up for obvious reasons, because the term premium inflation risk premium and term premium will go to the roof, and you're in a significant global crisis. So that's the story. And you can work out whether you think it's likely. I regard it as not unlikely, but not probable. The second question was, can we have a political order between countries which don't have common values? Well, my answer, I'm afraid, is I don't know, and what's the alternative? I mean, the problem is, this is your question, wasn't it? The problem is that we're going to move into a world ineluctably when there are Asian great powers and great powers of European origin, culturally. Europe is not going to be a great power, I think. And they have very different histories and values, and some very, very difficult history between them, which the Chinese have not and never will forget. Okay? So the hope has to be that we cannot base the political order on common values, but we might be able to base it on common interests. Because we clearly have common interests. Well, what are the common interests? And unless you're a lunatic, unfortunately one of them is President of the United States, it's pretty clear where these are. We share a single planet, which we are transforming at a massive rate because we've reached that stage in our development. We share an economic system. We share a security system. Nobody is going to be unaffected by a nuclear war somewhere. So we have immense interests in common. I genuinely think, I genuinely think from my contacts over the last 25 years that the Chinese leadership does understand that. They may not like it, but they do understand it. I'm pretty sure that as things evolve, the Indians will and do understand that. That's not relevant now, but it will be 20 or 30 years from now. The Europeans sure understand that. I think the main problem is the US. Finally, on Brexit, I have nothing good to offer on this. I wrote a column last July before I went on holiday, which I still recommend, I haven't changed my mind, which says, in essence, Britain doesn't have a government and it cannot negotiate a deal on Brexit. I would say that everything that has happened here, I suppose I do not recommend that any of you spend a lot of time following British politics, first of all, because your own politics are so interesting, and partly because
Really tough competition.
British politics are a serious mess, as you know, although they have amusing moments. There is no chance that, in my view, that the current Conservative government can negotiate Brexit without falling apart. Because the EU has a very clear and immensely strong, and I think somewhat limited but understandable position, which we can't deal with. They can't deal with that without falling to pieces. There is very little time left, and the Prime Minister is, to quote the former Chancellor, a dead woman walking. She has, she has no authority. I like her. I think but she's in an impossible situation. So we can't withdraw the application without the Conservative Party falling to pieces. So my view is we will have no deal. The only alternative possibility is that the government collapses. It cannot produce a majority at all after this. We have a general election. Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, which I think would be better for this. I don't think it would be much better for anything else, because my sympathy with that sort of soft trot is rather limited. But, so what we call a soft Trotskyite is what to explain. But I think we cannot do this deal. So my expectation is that the most likely outcome is that we would leave the EU without a deal. That might lead you, and this is my last sentence, since you're Irish, I don't know whether you live here or whether you're visiting, to the question of what will happen to Ireland. If we leave without a deal, the EU will put up borders. It has to. So Ireland will get split. Now, some people think that the EU will make the proposal to Northern Ireland that it could avoid this problem by voting to leave the UK. And under the Good Friday Agreement, that possibility exists. If the majority of people in Northern Ireland vote to leave the UK to join Ireland, they aren't free to do so. And this shock will be so great that it might persuade many former unionists that that is the future. That is not I do think that one of the possible consequences of Brexit is that Ireland will be united. I would add only that, as I've talked about this with many friends in Dublin, this is not a prospect which they regard with unalloyed enthusiasm, because it will be a very expensive addition to Ireland. But everything is now in flux in Britain and its future relations with Europe and also the world.
I think I will abuse my prerogative and make the last question. It's a very short one. It's how do you factor in climate change in your projections concerning long-term growth trends? It will be a drag, a boost?
Well, I've tended to think that I'm discussing the next few years, apart from the global transformation, and over the next few years, on the basis of what I've seen, climate problems will increase. That's clear. We can see this already, but not so much. It's not to such a scale as to have a measurable impact on aggregate global GDP. We have to get to serious disaster territory before we see that. That could well happen, but it's not going to in my view, within this time horizon. The problem with climate change is that I've used this description before. It's the classic, boiling the frog thing. I mean, we're dead before we realized that anything really was happening. In the short run, it will promote quite a lot of investment. I mean, in Europe, in China, in India, there is now reasonably agreed view that something has to happen. And even in America, actually, there's an enormous amount of investment going into renewables. And that process I can expect to continue. The car industry is moving to electrics. Now, that's only partly because of climate issues, but it's part of it. So I think there'll be quite a lot of investment, not as much as we need. So that will be quite positive. It's potentially a positive for growth if we exploited it properly. So it's an opportunity as well as a problem. Again, I don't believe in the next 4 or 5 years sort of period, I'm thinking about the next cyclical upswing, that it will be decisive. I am persuaded that the risks associated with climate change could cumulatively become enormous, probably social and political more than obviously economic. I mean, for example, desertification in important areas, increasing the flood massively of immigrants into Europe from Africa, and the Middle East. Major political and social upheaval, particularly in poorer countries, because of it. So it's a gigantic challenge. On the reading of what I see, probably more in the second half of the century than the first half. That may be wrong. But I don't think it affects the economy in the short to medium run. And that's, of course, part of the problem, because most policymakers don't focus on it because of that reason, even if they recognize the risk. And, of course, some policymakers are determined to and are able as well to ignore it. So that's my view of climate change.
Well, let me conclude by thanking you again. As I said in the beginning, it was a real brilliant view over the world, and always with some sense of humor, which is quite British, but it's quite good for us to hear. Thank you very much, and I hope you come again.
That'd be a pleasure. A great pleasure. After all your political problems are solved.
I'm sure if you come more often, it will be more easy for us to solve the problems. Thank you very much. Thank you. I agree.